My name is...
Xiao, the conqueror of demons.
I hate a lot of things, and I don't particularly like anything. What I have is not a dream, because I will make it a reality. I'm going to
Break the Genshin Impact tier list with my pogo stick.
Hello and welcome to this likely not so original little series that I've elected to call Genshin Optimization, where we'll be taking a look at some of our favorite Genshin Impact characters and breaking down how they work and how to build them to maximize their usefulness on your teams. My name's Xiao, and I'm the kind of guy that just sits down for a couple of days to research and plan out the progression and builds of all my characters before I ever even first turn on any new RPG game. And today we're putting that obsessive perfectionism into work as we talk about the ultimate edgy Sasuke Uchiha wannabe, Xiao. So without further delay, let's get right into it. Xiao is an animo polearm user who can put out some fantastic animo-based DPS at the cost of constant health drain, but just give him a healer support for the sustain and he becomes an absolutely insane main DPS character. Xiao's normal attack chain is very quick and powerful with strong attack scaling and great AoE coverage, and his charge attack is an upward thrust that hits any large AoE in front of him, staggering and potentially launching enemies that he hits. But his main area of interest is his plunging attacks, which hit hard in an AoE that gets expanded by his ult when it's active. This, followed by his ult, is what I would suggest putting your talent upgrade materials into when building him. Xiao's E-skill, Limnoscatic Wind Cycling, is a forward lunge that can be used both in mid-air and on the ground and deals respectable attack scaling animo damage. The 10-second cooldown can feel a bit long, however, if you don't properly manage the two charges that he starts with. You should attempt to properly stagger your first two uses of the ability and then use it on cooldown, which will essentially cause the skill to function as having a 5-second cooldown for the first few uses. But in fights that go much longer, you can definitely fill the longer cooldown. His C1 gives a third charge, which should help as well, but isn't necessary. My Xiao is C0 and the skill cooldown is perfectly manageable with just 2 charges and a little practice. Xiao's ult, Bane of All Evil, is a transformation that I would most relate to a mixture of Razor's ult and Tartaglia's E-skill. The ult lasts up to 15 seconds and constantly drains between 3 to 2% current HP every second it's active depending on your skill's rank. But in exchange, Xiao gains the ability to jump high enough to plunging attack from a flat height, his normal charged and plunging attack range and especially damage are notably increased, and his damage is converted into unoverridable animo damage. Additionally, his Ascension 2 talent grants him a 5% damage bonus plus an additional 5% for every 3 seconds that he's been on the field with his ult active, up to a maximum of 25%. Potentially even more so than Razor, Xiao is a very greedy main DPS, needing to stay out on the field for a majority of his ult's duration to get the maximum value from it, as it ends immediately if Xiao leaves the field, losing the passively stacking damage bonus along with it. So then, let's get into the meat and potatoes and talk about his build paths. Xiao is a main DPS through and through. There's really nothing about his kit that lends especially well to any other playstyle. As such, this is what we'll be focusing on in this video. For weapons, any of the available 5-star polearms, if you have one, will serve great on him, as they all have fantastic base attack and viable passives for him. As a budget player myself though, this series will be taking a free-to-play and budget-centric approach, so let's look at some of the options that are much more wallet-friendly. A bit contrary to my previous statement though, I have been lucky enough to previously pull a Primordial Jade Spear, but should I not have access to this best-in-slot weapon, the 4-star weapon discussion for Xiao has revolved around the Deathmatch and the Black Cliff Pole. The Deathmatch gives somewhat low base attack for a 4-star weapon, but it gives a very substantial crit rate buff, even more than a 5-star circular artifact when maxed. Its passive is also fine, but not as strong as other Battle Pass weapons. If you're planning to build Xiao over other characters this BP cycle, it's definitely a good option for him. On the other hand is the Black Cliff Pole, which gives a nice bit higher base attack than the Deathmatch and gives crit damage as the stat. Its passive, however, is not exceptionally great outside of fights against larger groups, as it grants an attack bonus that stacks every time you defeat an enemy. So against things like bosses or even small numbers of enemies, this weapon passive can often end up next to useless when, in my opinion at least, consistency is king. Additionally, while I don't own these weapons myself for personal tests, my research has found consistently that Deathmatch, if you're willing to buy the Battle Pass for it, generally tends to outperform the Black Cliff Pole in damage thanks to a more consistent and balanced stat line. Both of these weapons do require a notable bit of resource investment to acquire though, which is where the free-to-play craftable polearms come in. While both are focused more on a normal and charge attack playstyle, their stats and passives are still generally very good. The prototype Starglitter is definitely the better of the two options here. The energy recharge substat is useful on Xiao, who needs a decent bit to keep his ult up on cooldown due to the 70 energy cost. Additionally, the passive grants an 8% normal and charge attack damage bonus after using an elemental skill, which can stack twice and last 12 seconds. resistance. And with Xiao's skill having 2 charges that you can quickly stagger, you can make great use of this passive to grant an almost instant 16% normal and charge attack damage bonus near the beginning of combat and then keep it up for the entire time. Especially for free-to-play players, this can be a potentially great option. Just keep in mind that the bonus does not affect his plunging attack damage, so be sure to fit more normal and charge attacks into your combos to make use of that passive. Something arguably just as difficult to get your hands on are his artifacts, a constant struggle for any Genshin player. I would recommend a 2-piece of the Viridescent Venerator set highly, as most if not all of your damage will be anemo based, and this 2-piece set grants a 15% anemo damage bonus. I wouldn't recommend the 4-piece of the set though. While its swirl damage bonus may seem nice and you should attempt to proc the reaction with Xiao, it's not where the majority of his DPS comes from like the other anemo characters, and its passive can't reduce anemo resistance. There are also much better options to pair with the 2-piece. The main one I would suggest is a 2-piece Gladiator set for the 18% attack buff, a solid bonus for any main DPS character, especially one with scalings as good as Xiao. You can also potentially forego the 2-piece Viridescent set to pick up a 4-piece Glad set if you wanted to maximize a normal attack-centric playstyle, which may be very strong, but there's a bit more power in his plunging attacks than his normal attacks despite the attack speed difference, so I would recommend sticking with the Viridescent and Glad 2-piece bonuses that are much more versatile to buff your entire kit. As for main stats, the best option is to stick with a standard main DPS spread of attack on your timepiece, anemo damage bonus on your cup, and crit on your circlet. The sweet spot you should go for on crit rate is 60 to 70%, so if you need it to hit that sweet spot, go for crit rate on your circlet, otherwise crit damage will be a huge damage buff. Attack percent is also fine if that's all you currently have, but it's definitely not the ideal. Your substats will also follow a similar priority to other main DPS characters, but with a couple exceptions. Top priority is, of course, crit stats. You again want to have between 60 to 70% crit rate when all is said and done. With Xiao's godsend of an Ascension stat up to 24% crit rate, you should be able to hit this fairly easily. Then try to hit at least a 1:2 ratio with crit rate to crit damage. Crit damage has much less diminishing returns than crit rate though, so stacking that higher is not a bad move if you can. After this falls attack, percent stats are generally better than flat stats in late game due to the scaling. Then after attack, energy recharge, and elemental mastery are great stats to wrap up your artifacts with. If you're planning to run Xiao with another anemo character consistently on your teams who can serve as a battery for Xiao, which I would highly suggest, then you can get away with lower energy recharge on him, but otherwise you should look to sit around 150 to 160% to have your ult up on cooldown. Elemental Mastery is also a decent stat to buff your swirl damage. Swirl reactions again aren't a majority of your damage like other anemo characters, but it's still useful and a much better stat to end up with than defense or other flat stats. As well, if your artifacts have an HP stat, it's not that bad like with many other characters. While definitely not ideal, a bit of HP can help to mitigate the health drain of your ult just a bit. The drain is current HP percent based though, so it affects you the same no matter how high your max HP is, but simply working with a higher pool means that the drain still leaves you with a more manageable number. But running a healer with him already mitigates this drain, so it's not something you should actually seek out for on his artifacts. So, how exactly should you be using this chat of an edgelord? Well, 2 simple words: plunging attacks. But seriously, as I've said previously, he's very similar to Razor in that he's an extremely greedy main DPS. He wants to be out on the field for as long as possible because if you switch him out while his ult is up, it ends immediately and you lose all the value from the remaining duration and passively stacking damage buffs that you just gave up. And that's a notable damage buff to give up, so don't switch off Xiao while his ult is active unless you absolutely have to. But at the same time, also don't be afraid to switch him out early if you do need to. It's better to lose some of your ult's value than for Xiao to die because you kept him out while he was way too low. With a 15-second duration and an 18-second cooldown, that 3-second window when your ult is down is your best opportunity to switch through the rest of your team for your skill rotations. When playing Xiao, he's mostly going to be on the field when his ult is up, or at least he should be. As such, you should be playing him with the overly memed but definitely very powerful pogo stick plunging attack gameplay style, as this yields the highest DPS. When playing with Xiao, do remember to wait to use your plunging attacks near the apex of his jumps, as plunging attack damage scales with the height up to a point. To get the best results, you should also focus on getting consistent with his main tech, normal attack jump canceling. I first learned about this tech myself via a YouTube video by a guy named Valkyr about a month and a half ago, link in the description to that. The essence of the tech is that after plunging, you normal attack and jump at the same time. The normal attack cancels some of the end lag of the plunging attack, and then it immediately gets canceled by the jump while still dealing damage and setting you up for another plunging attack. Then you just continue this on repeat to maximize your damage. It is worth noting, however, that the execution is somewhat tight, not enough to be exceptionally difficult, especially with a little practice, but it is enough to make the tech very inconsistent to perform on mobile. Additionally, your horizontal mobility is also very limited during this, so you should focus on using your E skill to help reposition when you need. Just be sure to, as I've mentioned before, stagger your E skill for the best results. After using your first charge, you should wait until the cooldown hits about 5 seconds, then use your second charge and continue to use it roughly on cooldown. This will evenly stagger the skill to allow you to stack your Ascension 4 passive talent to max stacks for 1 or 2 more uses of it. This talent grants a 15% damage bonus on the skill on each successive use, stacking up to 3 times with those stacks lasting 7 seconds. Now finally, let's take a look at some of his potential team comps. When building a team around Xiao, it's important to remember his extremely greedy kit and that his main and really only elemental reaction is Swirl. Being an Anemo main DPS, you're also going to have issues with breaking some shields. While not especially weak to any elemental shields, Xiao won't be able to quickly break any by himself either. Instead, he'll need to make use of his allies' elements or the environment to swirl against those shields. As such, your team should remain more flexible than others so that you can change your support slightly depending on the domains and abyss floors that you take him into. You'll also want teammates who do really well while off the field. First and foremost though, you'll want a healer to mitigate your ult's HP drain, and I'd suggest building your team's core around this decision. Jean is arguably the best option for her strong burst heals and because she provides some battery capabilities alongside the Anemo buff for slightly reduced cooldowns and lower stamina costs. Then it is also always a great option in teams, providing the Pyro element alongside a great heal and attack buff with his ult. And then Diona provides decent healing and a shield while being great at constantly keeping the Cryo element up. If you somehow have her at C6 as well, her ult also provides a massive 200 elemental mastery buff while you're standing inside it. I'd suggest picking one of these 3 to pair with Xiao as your core and then rotating supports and sub DPSs in the other 2 slots depending on the situation. As far as good picks for their off the field elemental support and sub DPS capabilities, it's hard to go wrong with Fischl for the Electro element. She's one of the best characters in the game, keeping Electro up, dealing good damage, and providing elemental particles through Oz, all while she's completely off the field. Zhongling's Guoba and Fantastic ult also serve Xiao's needs well for the Pyro element, plus if you run her alongside Bennett, they'll provide the Pyro Resonance for a 25% attack buff. Xingqiu is the go-to Hydra support for many teams, but you won't actually proc his ult as much as you might want with just plunging attacks. So if you do decide to run Xingqiu, just be sure to include at least some normal attacks in your combo strings to get the maximum value out of his ult. Kaio or Ganyu are both great cryo options, especially if you're also running Diona as your healer to give you the Cryo Resonance for the crit rate buff. Both ults are great at keeping cryo applied to enemies, and Ganyu especially can deal massive damage as a support or sub DPS. Just don't rely on this buff too much to hit your 60 to 70% crit rate sweet spot, as you should still maintain a balance to be able to swap Xiao's team out as needed. And of course, Venti and Sucrose are also solid supports in any team for their ults to group enemies, and in this case to also serve as fantastic batteries and provide the Anemo Resonance if you aren't already running Jean. Xiao's AoE damage can also make great use of their enemy grouping for massive wombo combos. I would, however, avoid Geo supports with Xiao as the Geo and Anemo elements have absolutely no interactions with each other. But if you do already have your elemental needs covered, then Albedo for his elemental particle generation and strong sub DPS capabilities, or especially Zhongli, who is extremely overtuned and does practically everything now after his 1.3 buffs, are still solid options to fill an open slot. Just don't let it take up the slot of an element that would potentially serve your team better. And that's Xiao. You may cut yourself on all that edge while playing him, but it's a fun time nonetheless. While my personal enjoyment still leans a bit more towards Keqing and Tartaglia's playstyles, Xiao is still extremely fun, much more so than I was expecting. If I hadn't decided to start this series, I was potentially considering skipping his banner, but I'm definitely glad I didn't. He's got a very unique and engaging gameplay style, and his damage output is phenomenal. If you're looking for a good main DPS, Xiao is a solid option, but just keep in mind his team comp needs when using him, as he, ironically for such a greedy DPS, relies very heavily on them to reach his maximum potential. Thanks so much for watching the video all the way through. Let me know who you'd like to hear me talk about next in the comments below, and have a great rest of your day.